For those of you that may have been living under a rock, Deadlock has just dropped one of the biggest patches the game has seen so far. We're talking item changes, hero adjustments, and even full ability reworks. Wraith literally has a completely new ultimate now. And honestly, this might actually be the most important patch that Deadlock has had so far. Now, a lot of creators are already breaking down every single patch note, but instead of reading numbers line by line, getting into the nitty gritty, I want to talk about the big picture, about why this patch is such a big deal for the future of Deadlock. Because when you start looking at the scale of these changes, it tells us a lot about where the developers want Deadlock to go. First off, just look at the size of these patch notes. This thing is massive. There are item changes, buffs, nerfs, tweaks, and adjustments happening all over the place. And the same goes for heroes. We're seeing ability adjustments, balance changes, and in some cases abilities that work completely differently than they used to. Some heroes that weren't seeing a whole lot of playtime will probably start showing up again after all these changes. And in some cases, these aren't just small number tweaks. Wraith is probably the biggest example here. Her ultimate was completely redesigned. That's not just a buff or a nerf, that's the developers stepping back and rethinking how they want this hero to actually function. On top of that, Wraith also received an additional mechanic where her playing cards can now generate as a spade, heart, club, diamond, or even a joker, each with different effects. So not only did her ultimate change, but her overall kit has now even more depth and variation. When you start seeing changes like that, it tells you the developers aren't afraid to revisit older designs and add more complexity where it matters. But the part of this patch that I find the most interesting isn't just the number of changes or even what those changes are, it's what those changes tell us about how Valve wants Deadlock to work. When you look across the patch, a pattern starts to appear. A lot of abilities now feel slightly weaker at their base level, but the upgraded versions are significantly stronger. What that suggests is that the developers want heroes to feel powerful, but they don't want to hand that power to you for free. You actually have to invest points into your abilities, think about your upgrades, and make real decisions about how your character develops during the match. Early in the game, you might feel a little weaker than before this patch, but once you start investing into your abilities and unlocking those stronger upgraded tiers, your character really starts to come online. That tells me the developers want abilities and upgrades to matter more. They want players to earn their power. And in a lot of games, balance changes can feel random. Things get buffed, nerfed, moved around, but it doesn't always feel like anyone really knows what the game is supposed to feel like. They don't know what vision they have for the game. They're just doing whatever they want. This patch feels different. It feels like the developers are making a conscious decision about how they want the game to work. And even if every change doesn't end up perfect, the fact that they're willing to push the game in a direction, any direction, gives me a lot of confidence in where Deadlock is heading. Because this isn't just a bug fix patch or a balance patch or even a rework patch. This is a directional patch, alright? And there's another thing this patch makes me think about. It feels like the developers are starting to understand their game more and more. I mean, if you look at some of the newer heroes that have been added, characters like Silver, Celeste, or Graze, their kits feel really well thought out and unique, right? Their abilities have clear strengths, clear weaknesses, and interesting interactions with the rest of the game. They feel intentional. When you compare that to some of the older heroes that were around earlier in development, a few of them honestly feel a little more thrown together, a little less intentional, a little less unique. I mean, their abilities work, but they don't always have that same level of depth or synergy that you are experiencing with some of the newer characters. But don't fret, because that's actually really normal for a game that's still evolving, that's still relatively early in its development. The developers are still experimenting. They are trying ideas, figuring out what works and what doesn't, and how players interact with the game and the systems in that game. But over time, as they start to understand the game better, that refinement starts to show up everywhere in Deadlock. So what does that mean for us as the players? Well, first it means that our upgrade decisions are going to matter a lot more than they did before. You can't just rely on your base abilities anymore. If you want your character to feel strong, you are going to have to actually invest into your kit and into your abilities. I think one of the interesting side effects of this is how this could affect snowballing in our different games. Because if upgraded abilities are significantly stronger than their base versions, then having more souls and more levels than your opponent becomes even more important. If you get ahead, if you're up in souls, your abilities are going to hit those stronger upgrades faster. You're going to become more powerful. Your power spikes are going to be even higher. And that means that the power gap between you and the enemy team could become much more noticeable. So, in theory, that could make it easier to close out games when you have the lead. Deadlock has had a problem with closing out the games recently. Our games are going 40, 50, maybe sometimes even 60 minutes. But now, if your team is ahead and you've invested into your abilities, you're not just slightly stronger, you might actually be significantly stronger. Now, whether that ends up being good or bad for balance, we'll have to see. But it definitely makes things like farming souls, gaining levels, and managing your upgrades even more important than before. And honestly, patches like this are a really good sign for the future of the game. One of the worst things that can happen to a competitive game is when development slows down and nothing really changes. The meta gets stale, the same strategies get played out over and over, you see the same heroes over and over, the same bans over and over, and eventually players just start to lose interest. But when developers are willing to make big changes like this, it tells us the game is still evolving. Deadlock is still in a stage where the developers are figuring out what the game should ultimately look like. Now they have an idea, right? That's what this patch tells us, but they are still experimenting. They are testing ideas and they're making these big changes to see how we, the players, respond to them and to see how they work, right? Now some of these ideas will work, some of them won't work, and that's just the way that this goes, but it's how games get built, especially competitive games. Balance is not an easy thing to do. So when I see a patch like this, I don't just see the balance changes, I see a game that's still growing. A game where the developers are learning more about what works and what doesn't work, and they're willing to learn that through trial and error. They're willing to learn what Deadlock is actually supposed to feel like. And that's exactly what we want to see at this stage of a competitive game, because a stagnant game is a dying game. But a game that keeps evolving, where the developers are experimenting, adjusting, and refining the experience, that's a game that can last for years. And if the patches like this keep coming, Deadlock's future looks really, really promising. Now, this patch is way too big for me to break down every single hero change in one video, so I'm going to be doing quick breakdowns of each hero in my shorts. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and hit the subscribe button. I hope that you all have a wonderful day. Take care. Hacked out.